This past weekend here on the Korean peninsula, North Korea's Kim Jong-un watched a live fire test of multiple rocket launch systems that he claimed demonstrated the regime's destructive capability. With more on Press Perspective today. Hope your work week is off to a good start. It's Monday, March 16th here in Seoul. I'm Min Sun-hee. Today we turn the spotlight onto shows of strength, if you will, here on the Korean peninsula, as South Korea and the U.S. conduct their annual joint exercises, while North Korea test fires a series of ballistic missiles. For more on this, I have independent journalist Kelly Kasulis Cho here in the studio. Kelly, it's great to have you here.
Honored to be here, as always.
I also have Professor Park Won-gon at Ewha Womans University live on the line. Professor Park, it's a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you for having me.
Kelly, let's start here in the studio. So as I mentioned, North Korea launched a series of ballistic missiles this past weekend. Let's start with details on that, as well as South Korea's response, of course.
On Saturday, North Korea launched more than 10 ballistic missiles, according to South Korea's military, into the East Sea. I will say, coming from American media, traditionally, at this point, the United States does not tend to pay much attention to these from a media perspective unless they're intercontinental ballistic missiles. So for people who don't know, those are the ones that have a much farther range, could reach potentially the continental United States. This came at a time where South Korea and the United States were conducting routine joint military drills. It also comes around the time that the Prime Minister of South Korea met with President Trump in Washington, and they discussed some potential dialogue with North Korea. So on one hand, it comes off as a little routine. On the other hand, decades into this war, or the stalemate, so to speak, military people, analysts, they pay attention to these kinds of provocations.
Right. Professor Park, in recent times, there have been questions about whether or not Seoul and Washington need to adjust their combined exercises and other aspects of their alliance's posture to complement outreach to Pyongyang. What are your thoughts?
Well, the reason we hear this argument that the United States and South Korea should adjust their combined military exercise is mainly because North Korea strongly demanded it. In fact, North Korea often presents the suspicion of this exercise as precondition for dialogue, especially with the United States. For example, at the 9th Workers' Party Congress, Kim Jong-un said that if the United States respect what he called the current status of DPRK and abandon its hostile policy, then there is no reason the two countries cannot have better relations. When the North Korea talks of the hostile policy, it usually means two specific things. First, the combined military exercise between U.S. and South Korea, and second, the deployment of the U.S. strategic assets, such as nuclear bombers, aircraft carriers, or nuclear submarines around the Korean peninsula. We saw the same pattern during the 2018 and 2019 summit between Kim Jong-un and Trump. At the time, North Korea repeatedly asked for the suspension of joint military exercise and the reduction of strategic asset deployment. So from the North Koreans' perspective, these activities are serious security concern. But from the perspective of South Korea and the United States, the exercise play a very important role. They are essential for military readiness and deterrence. In other words, the fact that North Korea dislikes them so much actually shows how effective they are as deterrent. The bigger problem is that even if the United States and South Korea suspend or scale back this exercise, there is no guarantee that North Korea would improve relations with South Korea, and mostly it might open the door to dialogue with the U.S. And there is another even more difficult condition that North Korea has raised. Kim Jong-un said the United States should respect the current status of North Korea written in its constitution. But today, North Korea's constitution clearly defines the country as a nuclear weapons state. So essentially, North Korea is asking the international community to accept it as a nuclear power and then negotiate arms control rather than denuclearization.
Right. And Kelly, as you mentioned earlier, prior to Saturday's missile launches by North Korea, South Korean Prime Minister Kim Il-suk and US President Donald Trump met in Washington, D.C. to talk about possible dialogue with North Korea's Kim Jong-un. Could you tell us a bit more?
Yeah, well, according to South Korea's account of those conversations, President Trump, reportedly patted himself on the back for the summitry of 2018. It's almost, 10 years now. I was there at the time. It was very exciting, but, the situation is essentially the same since then in terms of, the United States' goal of, denuclearizing North Korea and North Korea's goal of keeping its, sovereignty and its nuclear program, if you will. But he also expressed that he is the only one in the West that can deal with this problem. He also expressed that, I think the quote was, it would be good if he could meet with Kim Jong-un again. These kinds of off-the-hand or off-the-cuff remarks from President Trump expressing interest in meeting with North Korea are certainly not new. The first time around when President Trump had these summits with North Korea, no matter how you feel about it, it was pretty clear that it was a way to show off, and that President Trump has since continued to brag about his relationship with the North Korean dictator. The other thing to point out, I think, is, while the U.S. might be open to dialogue, it's unclear whether North Korea actually would. North Korean state media has essentially suggested that it has no interest in speaking with South Korea, which is clearly one of the most important players in this conflict. And I believe the KCNA also put out a statement saying essentially that North Korean leader Kim Jong-un would be interested if the United States could just accept its nuclear program. I'm not a full-time expert on North Korea, but being a reporter on it for 10 years, I find that somewhat unlikely to happen, at least officially. The other thing to point out, I think, is while Trump says things like this, the United States is very distracted with what's going on in the Middle East, as well as numerous domestic problems. It's unclear whether Trump expressing interest in speaking with North Korea really means it's at the top of his agenda, and the truth is likely not at this moment.
Right. Professor Park, with regard to what Mr. Trump has said, do you believe that he is one of the very few leaders who can actually break the deadlock with North Korea? And do you suppose a bilateral meeting is likely in the near future?
Well, yes, I do think President Trump is probably one of the very few leaders who might be able to meet Kim Jong-un and try to break this current deadlock. In both Republicans and Democratic parties of the United States, it's actually hard to imagine another U.S. president being as willing as Trump was to meet Kim directly. We already saw this during his first term when Trump held 3 meetings with Kim Jong-un between 2018 and 2019. That kind of direct leader-to-leader diplomacy was very unusual in history of U.S.-North Korean relations. More recently, we also saw that signal that Trump might want to try again. For example, late last October, just before the APEC summit, Trump visited South Korea and said that he would be willing to meet Kim Jong-un if Kim reached out to him. At the time, Trump even said that he considered North Korea a sort of nuclear power. He also noted that U.S. still has sanctions in place, and that sanction could be an important starting point for negotiation. However, Kim Jong-un did not respond to that proposal at the time. So in practice, Trump's attempt to open a new dialogue did not lead to an immediate meeting. That said, Trump later explained the situation is a bit differently. He said that he had been very busy and that there was simply no opportunity to talk. But he also emphasized that he had built a very personal, good relationship with Kim Jong-un and that he would be willing to try again. Interestingly, Kim Jong-un has also sent a somewhat positive signal. In speech at the Supreme People's Assembly last September, Kim said that he will personally has good memories of President Trump. In North Korean political language, that kind of expression usually suggests that Kim is at the least open to the possibility of meeting again. But the key question is timing. Whether such a meeting could happen in the near future is still very uncertain, especially because of the ongoing conflict involving Iran. In U.S. politics, Iran and North Korea are often compared because both are seen as the anti-US states pursuing nuclear capability. If the United States responding very strongly to Iran, even to the point of military action, it may become politically difficult for Washington to take a much softer approach toward North Korea. So at this point, we probably need to want to wait and see how the broader international situation develops. Meeting between Trump and Kim Jong-un is certainly possible, but whether it will happen soon remains uncertain.
Right. And with regard to Iran, Kelly, North Korea also recently acknowledged Iran's appointment of Mojtaba Khamenei as the new supreme leader. What exactly did it say, and what are the broader implications of North Korea's stance on the unrest in the Middle East?
Yeah, well, North Korea maybe feels like it has to respond to what's going on and put out a statement. I think the official language that was used was that they acknowledge the new supreme leader of Iran. And just to back up for a second, I mean, what's happening is that the United States has, assassinated or toppled the last leader and has suggested that they would seek out, taking out the next leader, and has also hit targets of people that they thought might have succeeded the last supreme leader. So we're looking at the United States appearing to attempt a real regime change in Iran. And for North Korea, that is something that is inherently threatening and worth putting out a statement on, right? So North Korea called the U.S.-Israeli attacks on Iran, quote, illegal, and accused them of, quote, undermining the foundations of regional peace and security. Another quote they put out, they accused the United States and Israel of, undermining the political system and the territorial integrity of a country. I think those are kind of the two pole quotes from that statement, and that, just taking a step back, if you look at North Korea and what comes off to the West is like its obsession with its nuclear program, that nuclear program is really North Korea's ticket to sovereignty, to maintaining the Kim dynasty. It's its smoking gun, its threat so as to not be invaded, and it's very unlikely to abandon that, at least so far as history shows. So, of course, when you're looking at the United States invading Iran, in part, being justified by Iran's past, pursual of a nuclear program, it makes sense that North Korea would, put out a statement in support, if you will, of Iran, but also kind of hedging the line a little bit.
Right. Professor Park, earlier you spoke about the comparisons, the parallels drawn between North Korea and Iran. For the sake of some context, could you tell us a bit about the diplomatic relations between these two regimes, Iran and North Korea?
Well, the diplomatic relations between North Korea and Iran actually goes back quite a long time. The two countries established formal diplomatic relations in 1973, but their relationship became much closer after the 1979 Islamic Revolution in Iran. From that point on, both countries shared a similar strategic position. They were strongly opposed to the United States and were often isolated from the international community. The relationship deepened, especially during the Iran-Iraq War in 1980s. At the time, Iran needed weapons. North Korea became an important supplier. Pyongyang sold Iran artillery, missiles, and other military equipment. One well-known example is the Scud missile, which North Korea exported to Iran, and Iran later developed into its own missile program, such as Shahab series. Since then, cooperation has continued mainly in the military and missile fields. Many experts believe the two countries have exchanged technology, engineers, and technical knowledge related to the ballistic missiles. This is why their relations often attract attention from the international community, especially regarding missile and nuclear proliferation issue. However, it is important to understand that this is not a traditional alliance like the NATO. The relationship is often described as pragmatic and transactional. They cooperate when it benefits them, particularly in the defense technology, but there are very limited economic, cultural, or ideological ties between the two societies.
Right, and speaking about their defense partnership, Kelly, the South China Morning Post says that Iran and North Korea are likely to revive missile and nuclear cooperation in light of the U.S.'s latest military campaign against Tehran. What appears to back this outlook?
Well, we're 3 weeks into this conflict, which is maybe longer than some people had originally suspected. I think in the very first days of the U.S. and Israeli strikes, there was talk about maybe it'll only last a couple of days. And then President Trump started signaling that he was looking for a more permanent regime change. And now we see the latest news is that he's trying to drag in U.S. allies to be a part of this conflict and the issue over the oil tankers in the Strait of Hormuz. And it's getting quite messy quite quickly, right? So this article in the South China Morning Post quotes some analysts on North Korea, Iran, U.S. Nuclear proliferation issues. And those analysts quoted, some of which are South Korean, seem to think that essentially this moment where the global order is continuing to be disrupted. I mean, it's no secret that President Trump is kind of a wild card in terms of foreign policy and that relations have been frayed even between the U.S. and its allies. And now we have this war unfolding where there are missiles, striking international hotels in Dubai, that in a time of total chaos and uncertainty, Iran might turn to North Korea and look for some kind of closer cooperation maybe than in the last few years. And North Korea may, out of its own interest for its own sovereignty or to make a statement against invading authoritarian nations, might actually cooperate. And so a lot of this has to do with, there's a long suspected partnership in terms of missile technology being exchanged between North Korea and Iran, as well as some cooperation on uranium enrichment. And North Korea in recent years has been kind of an interesting nation in that it's been a bit more isolated than the pre-COVID era. And it's also invested a lot more in shows of force since COVID-19. And so these analysts were essentially suggesting that this might be actually an opportune time or just a time that necessitates a closer partnership between those two nations.
All right. And speaking about staying, of course, with partnership, Professor Park, there are some that say the Trump administration's military operation against Iran will ultimately push North Korea closer to China and Russia. Do you share this outlook? And if that is the case, how does this reality look to affect South Korea's and the U.S.'s efforts to engage North Korea?
Well, I think the war with Iran will definitely influence how North Korea sees its own security situation. In fact, I would expect North Korea to react in 3 main ways. First, North Korea will probably feel an even stronger need to strengthen its nuclear weapon programs. From Pyongyang's perspective, the lesson from the Iran situation is very simple. They will argue that Iran was attacked because it does not have nuclear weapons. So North Korea will likely use this war as justification to say our nuclear weapons are absolutely necessary for our survival. In other words, it could actually accelerate North Korea's nuclear development rather than slow it down. Second, somewhat paradoxically, this situation might also lower the threshold for U.S.-North Korean negotiations. Kim Jong-un must be watching the situation very carefully, and President Trump has shown that he can be very unpredictable, and the U.S. military operation against Iran, especially targeting of key leadership figures, will certainly make North Korea nervous. Also, Iran was attacked even while negotiations were ongoing. So if North Korea continued to refuse these talks completely, that could create additional pressure on Pyongyang as well. Because of that, Kim Jong-un may feel that continuing to reject Trump's offer for talk carries some risk. Interestingly, we already saw a small signal of this after the Iran strike. The North Korean foreign minister issued a statement, but the language was actually quite restrained. They avoided directly criticizing President Trump. Third, North Korea may try to strengthen cooperation with China and Russia. On the surface, this makes sense because the United States often describe China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea as part of broader anti-U.S. alignment. However, the Iran crisis also showed the limit of that cooperation. Even though the Iran does not relations with Russia and China, the level of practical support during this conflict has been quite limited. That means North Korea may realize that in the end, it cannot rely too much on other countries for its security.
Right, and hence it might come to the dialogue table with regard to talks between Kim Jong-un and U.S. President Donald Trump, of course. All right, on that note, we'll end today's talk. Professor Park, as always, thank you so much for your insights.
Thank you very much.
And Kelly here in the studio, thank you very much for your time and your thoughts.
Thanks for having me.
All right, that ends this edition of Press Perspective. As always, thank you for watching and see you back here same time tomorrow.